Hi everybody, can you hear me?
Hello.
Hi, Monica.
Chris, Raj, Adrian and
Monica.
Peter, hi there. So we're driving a bus. I haven't driven this bus before, but anyway, we'll see how that goes. I've got my app open for asking questions and we'll soon be going live.
Okay.
Monica, you are live right now.
Good afternoon and good morning, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Before I start officially, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous owners of the land we are on, whose elders past, present and emerging will keep us going into the future. So here we are this afternoon, our session on renewable energy projects for grid-connected mines. I've had the pleasure to stop into a few of the other sessions, and it's been, quite lively discussions and some very interesting perspectives. So my name is Monica Richter. I'm a project director for the Business Renewables Centre here in Australia, and the Business Renewables Centre is an education platform to help buyers to sign up to corporate power purchase agreements, large-scale renewable energy projects. And really, we're like a Google map. We help companies and organizations to find their way through to procuring renewable electricity. And we match buyers with buyers and provide trying to address some of those technical barriers that can be very hard when you start off looking at power purchase agreements. We've been very successful in Australia. I think there are 80 projects, power purchase agreements that have already been signed up and about 13 gigawatts. So we're also seeing that the mining industry has an appetite for renewables for a whole range of reasons. So we have with us a number of speakers. I'll introduce them I'll get them to introduce themselves very briefly, and then we can kick into the discussion. So I'll start first of all. Chris, can you introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Monica. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the virtual occasion here. It's great to be able to participate. My name's Chris Halliwell. I'm the Manager of Markets at Renewable Energy Hub. Renewable Energy Hub is a specialist energy consulting firm. We work on transaction advisory for the wholesale markets, renewable generators and large energy users, and we specialise in structured offtakes and asset transactions, and bringing to that a sort of specialised structured energy transaction experience from 20 years as one of Australia's leading wholesale markets service providers. We're currently developing, in collaboration with industry and funded by ARENA, Australia's first wholesale energy and environmental market digital platform, to create an environment energy users and energy market participants can source contracts that are more designed for some of the solutions that are required in the emerging energy market, and creates a platform whereby they can access liquidity for these types of contracts. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you, Chris. Aidan, I'll hand over to you now to introduce yourself.
Yes, hi Monica, and hello everybody. My name's Aidan Thomas. I'm a specialist at BHP. I work in the Sustainability and Climate Change team with a key focus on zero emissions electricity supply. So very pleased to be on the panel today.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Peter.
Thanks, Monica. Hello, everybody. Hello, the other panelists for today. Peter Mann. I am the Partners in Performance Energy and Emissions Practice Lead. Primarily in the last 12 months, we've been helping businesses with the development of their energy transition and emissions reduction strategies, and excited to be able to join this chat today.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Raj. Can't hear you very well. Still can't hear you very well, Raj. We might have to come back to you. That's, yeah. Not really. Yeah, no problem. All right, so I have Raj Agarwal, renewable energy industry expert. In renewable energy, a director on 6 companies, consulting to several significant projects in renewable energy in WA, Western Australia and Australia. He has a decade of investment banking experience in Macquarie, several years in Woodside, and a consultant to a number of renewable energy companies. So he's of the finance guru. So our first question, and it's been really interesting sort of to come into some of the other discussions as well. What are the main drivers for miners to consider renewables for grid-tied sites? And I'd love to hear, Aidan, your perspective on that from a corporate perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Well, I guess more broadly, the drivers for renewable energy, as we've heard throughout the virtual summit, is really around combating climate change through reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, and that helps you to meet your your company's sustainability targets, your emissions reduction targets. But it is also what both our investors and shareholders and our customers are increasingly wanting to see in terms of, particularly on the customer front, the move to green commodities and lower emissions commodities. And lastly, I suppose in a general sense that renewables are more cost competitive and can offer bottom line benefit as well. And I think with particular reference to grid connected sites and the main drivers for, say, corporate PPAs and green products through the grid is that thin copper wire that connects you to the grid is your access to the market as well. And so by being able to access the market, you can potentially access kind of the least cost or best value renewable energy projects or sites at potentially the lowest risk. So there is a distinct benefit or potential benefit to being grid connected for a mine site accessing renewable energy.
So the sustainability perspective sounds like that's really important, the volatility and risk management, and also the cost benefit that comes from that. Thank you, Peter. Do you have any perspective on the main drivers for miners at the moment?
Look, I'd reiterate what Aidan was saying. Having been in this space for a decade, the discernible difference I've noticed in the last 12 months has been the pressure that has been coming to senior managements and boards from large investors and shareholders. And they are all expecting an articulate, credible plan to be aligned to the Paris Accord, which will obviously drive into the Glasgow Accord. And so from a high level, 50% targets by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050, we're seeing more and more pressure coming to what are we going to be doing on shorter term timeframes than that. And we'd like to see some transparency around what are you doing for, on an ongoing yearly basis to track your progress and how you're traveling with success. So I agree with Aidan that from a macro level, I think all those pressures are still bearing. I'm seeing an intensifying of what are you doing in the shorter term, that we can have comfort that you're going to be on a pathway or roadmap to being able to achieve what I think we as a globe want to a 2030 and 2050. And another area I'd probably just add to the the investors, the regulators and shareholders is we're also seeing a change in employees' demands with the companies they're choosing to go and work for. In the younger generation, I do quite a few interviews with the 20 to 25 age set, and I would say it would be one of their top 3 priorities. What's the company I'm involved in doing with regards to climate change? So I think attracting talent and retaining talent is also a really important part of this.
Very values-driven generation that are coming through. Raj, let's test your microphone and see how that goes now. Oh, not really. No, we can't hear you, unfortunately, so just try that again. So I guess coming back to basics, what are the returns on investment that we're seeing miners realise from their investment in grid-connected renewables? Can you speak a little bit to sort of the costs and savings that are coming through? And I guess that's particularly going to be the case as we think about recovering the cost of COVID and trying to be competitive in a global market. So I'd be interested, Aidan, in your perspective on that, please?
Sure. Well, in terms of the return on investment, I think it's sometimes maybe the wrong metric to look at for, say, grid connected sites. It might be more you take an NPV view of say a corporate PPA against your internal market forecast, and really you're after projects that either match or beat your view of the market. In terms of return on investment. And we saw in our Chilean announcement late last year for 100% renewables that we were actually able to reduce our savings, reduce our costs by about 20% against our current providers. So I think there is definite potential for savings, but you might be comfortable matching your market forecasts and knowing exactly what you're after as well is key, because you might have an energy forecast, an LGC forecast. You might want to bundle them together, and so that might be different to your business as usual scenario where you don't procure LGCs, for instance. So there are a whole range of considerations you need to look at when considering, say, an ROI and or an NPV, NPC type consideration. Maybe break even suits you.
Absolutely. I heard in one of the other presentations, one of the miners said that they were getting 30 to 40% reduction in their costs of electricity, but then there were a whole range of risk management issues that they needed to bring into it. So I guess I'd like to turn to you, Chris, and hear a little bit more about the kinds of financial products that are available to help facilitate renewables, but also how to help manage some of that risk.
Thanks, Monica. Yeah, I think as we heard yesterday, and to Aidan's point now, the opportunity exists in that if you interact with the grid, then you can participate in essentially the wholesale financial market that overlays the physical grid. We heard from Bloomberg yesterday that it's more attractive economics in doing so because you can capture the cheapest in market option that is best matched against your consumption in that scenario, in comparison to potentially an on-site asset development model. So that does bring with it some good opportunity, but I guess in doing that, where you're facing a lot of the challenges that we see when we're adapting and innovating in this market, that comes with a whole new collection of risks. And I guess the fundamental problem with adaptation when it comes to energy markets, and I guess not dissimilar with taking on climate change and just even COVID, is that if you don't price the risks correctly, you take on too much risk. And I guess that's the purpose of risk management, is not necessarily to not take risk, but it's to make sure you're getting paid for the risks that you take. And so we've put a lot of work into creating some other types of wholesale contracts, other structures that can be used to firm and integrate these types of contracts. If you take on a PPA, essentially with a wholesale market generator, you're entering a financial contract, and that comes with a new collection of risks that people may not have had experience in managing on a portfolio based on energy consumer. And so really we've worked on kind of modelling what is worst case scenario in that PPA situation, and built a few tools that are available to manage that. And essentially that's another suite of financial market contracts. An example would be wholesale market financial swaps that you can enter into to protect against certain exposures that you may have in that PPA, be it breakdown in generation, be it failures in the grid, high price scenarios, where you can purchase contracts that are designed to help you integrate a PPA, generated from a PPA, against your specific consumption. And so just looking at what is the most extreme yet plausible scenario can really help you model that up. And so another example may be a solar shaped contract or the inverse shaped contract, which are a new collection of that you can use to match off against your PPA. A PPA does come with a lot of moving parts. You're essentially taking on a floating price exposure in the spot market and a floating volume exposure in the generation and the curtailment and the MLF impacts of that project. But there is now some tools in market to help you manage that in a much more cost-efficient way, and they've been innovating very actively across the wholesale market and trying to catch up with people being able to price the risk accurately. But essentially, it's an exercise in doing that in the most efficient way.
Great, thank you. I mean, I think that innovation piece is really important. So Raj, let's try third time lucky. Not really. I'm sorry. Yeah, all right. I can't hear you, unfortunately. So Peter, I might bring you in here on kind of what are some of the lessons that you've seen from some of the recent projects that have been signed. You know, we've talked a little bit about why the drivers for renewables, some of the risks and how you manage that, and the innovation that's coming into the marketplace. So what are some of the key lessons that you've seen through the market?
Yeah, and I might just also touch on the risk management piece with the grid. So we're doing work all over the world, and the grid that you're connected to does have an impact on what the business case is for your drive into lower cost electricity or energy for that matter. So I'll give an example in Africa, whereby they have load shedding. They have the demographics are the population will grow, their electricity or power needs will continue to increase, and they've got a mix between hydro and fossil fuel driven grids. And many of the miners we're working with over there, the risk of being able to obtain reliable, low-cost power over a long period of time from their grid is very high, and they also have load shedding uncertainty as well. So in many cases, the business case we're developing for them are behind-the-meter self-generation while still remaining connected to the grid is more compelling than actually being able to take your energy from the grid. Now, in their instance, they obviously have some load shedding issues. On the flip side of some of the other lessons that we've learned from that is when we've been developing business cases, there are a couple of different lenses that you need to take. So there's a technical piece, which is the optimization of a potential solution to match your load profile, and obviously managing the risk of that because production and safety are king within these mining groups. The second piece is the commercial side, is actually understanding how we could potentially bring in third-party capital. And we spoke about the return on investment for miners. What we've been finding is the expected return for miners' funds, the hurdle rate is much higher than the expected return for a very large green infrastructure fund. So to give you an order of difference, a miner might want a 15% return on there. It's not the cost of the capital, it's the return on the capital. A miner might want 15%, yet the large green infrastructure funds might be in the 6 to 8% range. Now that has a significant impact on the overall funding capability of these types of projects. And I've seen many cases where the internal hurdle rate has not been met by a renewable energy project, yet from an external perspective, it is very, very attractive. So that commercial structuring, I won't go into the detail, but it requires a lot of understanding with regards to how do you allocate risk, both from a physical sense on site, if you're doing a behind the meter, and also how do you actually potentially, interface and interact with the grid. So we're seeing, so once you've got through the technical and the commercial, you then obviously need to have a business case which is approvable from senior management and boards. And so pulling all of that together can be quite complex. And we're in a new space. We are looking to drive more and more of these and accelerate. I suppose one thing I'll point to is James Curting from Goldfields spoke about the Agnew project, which is now actually up and running. And that started with us helping him with a business case a couple of years ago. So you do need to bring some different levers from within the business together, get them aligned to understand what's possible. And then I suppose I can hand over to Raj, but then as you go through the development phase, there's a lot of problem solving that needs to occur to get a project up and being successful.
I mean, it really is a team effort, isn't to get it over the Raj, let's see what your microphone is like now.
Any luck this time?
Gotcha.
Finally, okay.
Oh, good. Well, I'm very pleased that you're with us. So we've had, quite a conversation, wandered through, motivation, some of the financial and risk management, working with the team, how you deal with that. So let's hear a little bit, your expertise in financing and how do miners think about financing this, and how do financiers think about it to sort of get the deal over the line?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I'm going to pull on some experience that I had sort of late last year, where we signed a relatively large PPA with one of the mines here in Western Australia, and I guess this is where some of what Peter was talking about is quite relevant, because we had a number of challenges that I don't think necessarily occur when you're trying to do a PPA with a retailer. And the complexity of that obviously flows on to what happens and how financiers see the risk of PPAs with mines. And so I broadly categorize it into sort of three areas that we had a lot of trouble in, and took a long time to solve. The first part of it was that the miner here that we were talking about had a forecast from reputed energy company that said the price of electricity on the grid is going to increase as more and more renewables come out of the system. And so the way they looked at the PPA was less from a decarbonization, less from a renewables perspective, and a lot more from the perspective of I'm basically hedging my price of electricity through your renewable PPA. And so what they sought from us, which was very, very difficult to give, was effectively a protection on the hedge, a financial protection, which required some sort of a banking guarantee to say, when you say you're going to deliver me power, you're actually going to deliver it. And if you're offline for any period of time, then you need to pay me damages. So that was
Yep.
a very, very difficult thing for banks to get their head around. The other part that was very complex to get around was they said that, look, we've got periods in the year where we're going to be completely shut down for maintenance, and you're going to be generating, so we don't want to buy your power at that time. And that could be lengthy periods. And so the question for somebody like us is, what do you do with that power? Do you then expose the financiers, which they have limited appetite to do, is expose them to the merchant price market? Or do you try and overlap the time where your facility is maintained versus when the mine is maintained? And that in itself led to a whole different range of complexities. And then the final piece of it was the mine has very different views force majeure is and what acts of God are. So from their perspective, it could be, their commodity for some reason being completely disrupted, or the supply chain of their commodity being completely disrupted, which might be very different to what the impact would be for a generator sitting here who might be impacted by a flood or an earthquake in this part of the world. And so then trying to marry up those two was another complexity, where do you have different definitions of force majeure. So all of these things were actually quite difficult to deal with, and I've been negotiating PPAs for the best part of 10 years, well before it became a big issue, but it was always with retailers, and you didn't have to deal with any of these matters in retailers. So these were some of the complexities that came through, and then having to get financiers on board, not just with the mine life, the commodity, and how long the commodity is going to last, but then also all of these other factors which are very, very different.
So it makes the lawyers very rich, doesn't it? Goodness me.
It
But
certainly does, yeah.
So Aidan, how do you, sort of, as an internal advocate for this, for getting renewables, how do you advocate this within BHP, and how do you actually bring the organisation along to get through the complexity into seeing those big advantages to the organisation?
I think the internal engagement piece is very important, even from a grid connected sense. There's still complexities like Chris kind of expanded on in terms of finding the right deal for you when you're going out to tender for, say, a commercial PPA, and then getting the business online with that deal, getting the internal support, because there's an internal education piece that is very necessary to help the business understand how to reduce emissions versus how to just procure energy, and that can be sometimes a bit of a learning process for everyone, because you see a line item on a proposal for LGCs, for instance, that you might not normally need to spend money on, and so you need to kind of explain, in the Australian context anyway, that certificates and green rights, and essentially the bragging rights for renewable energy, are decoupled from the energy component. So if you're all about reducing emissions, for instance, you really need to make sure that you've got the energy and the LGCs covered, and then there's various permutations of how that might flow through. So the internal education piece is very important with regard to the types of deals that you're looking at, to kind of get everyone on board, and then so that they understand the flow-on effects of emissions. How much energy are you actually procuring from renewables versus firming products? Are there, like Chris has said, are there floors or caps or other products in there to help manage risk? And potential derivatives reporting requirements, or bank guarantees, all those kinds of things that you then need to make sure are in place too. So it can be a real team effort in trying to kind of procure grid-based renewable energy, just like behind the meter or off-grid solutions.
Absolutely. So, Chris, I'd be interested in your perspective, that's trying to overcome some of the complexity for customers where, firming products come into it as we sort of start to move towards greater renewables capacity in the grid.
Yeah, I think absolutely. The market is moving dramatically towards an environment where there are more standardized solutions for people to manage these risks. In the emerging stages, we had almost a disruption, led by some of the economic returns for energy users to go directly into the wholesale market and take on contracts directly with generators in a bilateral arrangement. This proved to be quite lucrative as a function of high electricity prices and LGC prices, but it came with it a whole bunch of complexity, which, there was a lot of do as to how energy users can, understand those risks, evaluate those risks, make their way through a stakeholder engagement and governance process to sign off on those risks. And it just gets to the point where maybe the complexity is too much to bear, and the market to deal with some of that complexity. And so, we've put a lot of work into building out what will be Australia's first software platform to deal with some of this complexity, to create access to standardized contracts whereby an energy user, if they so wish to go into a bilateral contract directly with a generator, they need to be able to manage that arrangement as if they were a portfolio manager, whereby they can access contracts and solutions to de-risk that arrangement in a financial sense. Of course, there's underpinned by a physical contract, but you are in a virtual financial contract. And the issue has been there hasn't been easy access to the types of contracts that, in a price-efficient way, that it can allow you to deal with these risks. So on our platform, we've been working with industry to develop the types of contracts that people need as they're integrating with directly with renewables, and so they can still capture some of the low-cost solutions. It's not just solar and wind as an offtake. It's also how you deal with access contracts from battery storage technologies, demand-side technologies, virtual power plants, all different contributors to the wholesale energy market that can help you build together the most price-efficient and de-risk solution to suit your needs. Now, at that point, is it then still a function that an energy user is set up to do? Of course, energy users, large energy users are big running their mines and have got investing in productivity as opposed to running an energy sophisticated energy. And so we look towards the role of the energy retailer in that transaction as to who is best placed to help manage those risks and yet still give value back to the customer in a way that suits their needs. Now, a big driver for customers as we move into the next period, as the gents have noted, is that there is a real demand for renewable solutions, renewable-backed solutions, access from the grid. Customers need this, investors need this, stakeholders need this going forward. And so we need to find a way for customers to be able to access those solutions, be it physically backed if you're off the grid, or be it as a financial arrangement if you're plumbed into the grid, and you can still achieve those outcomes. And I think customers have spoken with their feet. It's not just economics. We still see a flood of interest and demand for renewables, even though the wholesale energy market has corrected somewhat. And we really need to keep servicing that need and creating these solutions.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So at the Business Renewables Centre a few months ago, we released our social licence to operate guide, and it's really designed to help set best practice thinking for companies and organisations that are signing up to corporate power purchase agreements, to make sure it's not just about the energy, but when you're investing in local and regional communities, you're thinking about local supply chains, creating local jobs for local communities, looking after the biodiversity, maybe some developments with agricultural communities in regional communities. I'd be really interested in your perspective on whether you, Aidan, are starting to think about that. As companies, their brands are associated with these projects, it makes it more critical that companies are not just thinking about electricity, but they have a long-term relationship with that project, and therefore potential, brand and reputation. So I'd be interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. I think it's a really interesting component to the corporate power purchase agreement process, and find, like I said before, finding the right project for you, because there's definitely the social value side of the equation that you always want to consider, particularly around the options, the first and foremost that you're looking at. So if you value additionality, for instance, then you may be favouring a new build site first and foremost over existing generation, and you may certainly not want to consider like a black energy and LGC approach, because you value the approach of creating new projects, new additionality, and new renewables essentially in the market. So yeah, from a starting point, that can really set your foundation, and then looking at the particular projects within the offers that you received in terms of how they are impacting the local or contributing to the local communities. Are they close to your mine sites, for instance, or are they in a separate part of the state? They're all things you need to weigh up when looking at all of the options, which can mean that it is a complicated process finding the right projects for you. So yeah, it's definitely a consideration, particularly shaping what you're after, but then maybe each project becomes of interest.
Peter, do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Yes, I do. Look, great question. It's one of the key levers that we've been looking at with mining companies when developing business cases and looking at options. When you're looking at large renewable projects, they need obviously land and proximity to the grid, and then also a customer. And I suppose we've been focusing on some of the complexity of that. So a very recent business case we just completed a few weeks ago, they've chosen to go behind the meter. They will stay connected to the grid. Initially, they will build enough to be able to optimize for their own load profile, and then they will look to potentially expand and provide stabilization services and capacity services back into the grid. One of the key drivers for that outcome was when they looked at their provision for closure. And in Australia and around the world, we do have a real issue with legacy assets that have been abandoned or stranded. And the regulators have been focused on how they can get progressive mine closure in place. And we've still got a way to go to actually get proper rehabilitation done. This saw the ability to repurpose their site in the longer term to an energy precinct and potentially be able to provide renewable energy back into the grid once their mining has stopped, and then also be able to, with the cost savings, generate the money to be able to progressively close and repurpose their site. So that was one lever, which is hard to put a tangible value around from an economics perspective, but it was definitely one lever that they were very, very interested in. And the second one was, by doing something on their own site, they would be able to develop jobs in the local community that would be developing, constructing and managing a renewable energy project. So for their instance, it made sense for them to look to do something behind the meter from the economics and the risk perspective. But what I think turned the final decision that way was the longer term social license to operate benefits they could foresee.
Yes, I think it's a really interesting opportunity for corporates in particular, and structuring facilities that have ongoing investment in the community, looking after traditional owners. I mean, there's many opportunities as we move forward here, and as we move towards 100% renewables, it is going to be impacting on the communities where these projects are built. So for those of you who are watching live, please feel free to submit your questions. I will go to the audience questions now. So this is a question so I guess it's for you, Aidan, because it's related to Chile. By 2022, Chile will 14 terawatt hours per year of renewables in mining. Is Chile a good model for grid-connected mines to reduce carbon footprint?
Well, from BHP's perspective, I think it's a good model because we have about 6 terawatt hours of that 14 contracted for our mine sites, and that is enabling us for our demand to meet 100% renewables. And it's probably a good example of the opportunities that grid-connected mines can achieve, because what happened with Chile was they had some separate networks in the north and the south, and then those networks were interconnected a few years ago, I think, and that allowed hydro in the south to basically complement solar in the Atacama Desert, and there's a bit of wind generation in the south in Chile as well. So from a grid-connected perspective, you could now access 100% renewables at a cost-effective price to power large loads, and so that was really probably a game changer for BHP in our short-term targets, and as well as for Chile in their renewable targets within their country, which is upwards of 50% by 2030, is enabling access to different resources across the country through the power of the grid connection. So I think it's a good example of working well for a mining company as well as across a network as well.
So there's been quite a few questions coming through in the chat here. So one of those questions, and I guess it was some of the theme of the last few days around hydrogen and electrification of materials. So can you see that there will be a stronger demand for renewables through the grid to provide clean energy for decarbonising the movement towards dematerialisation, I guess, power to green hydrogen electrification? Does anyone want to make a comment on that?
I'll have a quick go. Look, it's a great question, and we've been talking a lot about stationary energy and actually the lower cost, lower emission from a stationary energy perspective. We have done a piece of work recently for a gold miner that was looking at going underground, and they landed on a position that they would like to electrify as many of their mobile fleet assets as they could. There's some safety benefits with regards to the emissions underground. There's some cost benefits, and then there's ongoing life of asset with regards to ops and maintenance. So I think as we transition our grid to being greener, and whether that's off-grid, behind the meter and on-grid, as that transition occurs and we start getting to sort of the levels that some of our North American and South American friends have with regards to the advantages with a significant amount of hydro in their system, I think the next phase will be that we'll start to address electrification, and whether it's batteries or hydrogen, think there will be a panacea of one, but I think it'll be a mix. And I think that electrification, then we can go to the final stage, which is the reduction of our emissions that are coming out of our fleets. And I think that's something that a year ago, many people thought it was Horizon 3. Today, people are saying it's not far away. So I think it'll come quicker than we think.
Absolutely. It's Moore's law, isn't it? So there's another question here, and it's particularly in relation to Queensland, but what does the panel consider to be the major risks of grid-based renewables in Australia? Who wants to take on that question?
Look, Monica, I'll make a few points on that one. I think, there's the major risks are, obviously when you're interacting with the wholesale market is that, you're dealing with a gross pooled market pricing scenario, which you may not necessarily be able to have, complete control over. There's factors that are not quite as simple as we've learned over the last few years. There's some fairly dramatic changes to the grid and the performance of the grid, which is also rapidly adapting in response to the interaction of more variable energy that's changing the price. The price impacts quite dramatically. There's also physical constraint challenges around the grid, whereby a different congestion of generators in a largely uncoordinated fashion in more of the regional parts of the grid can have constraint impacts there, which can dramatically change economics for a project. I think everyone's very familiar with some of those challenges, certainly in the market and from the asset development side. But again, in the journey for a large energy buyer, such as a mine, to deal with one of these generators virtually, they're going to need to understand or have a view and a very thorough assessment of these risks, because it's not all about price, PPA price. It's about what is the weighted average cost that meets your consumption. And if that's not firmed or priced correctly, and you're in a contract with a variable generator that may be constrained or experiencing congestion and negative price impacts, it's a dramatically different economic position to be in. And so having good analytics and good data that can help you evaluate those options in a fashion that's not too complicated and not too scary is going to be key to driving the uptake of renewables going into the future.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So there's a question here for Raj. You want to make a comment?
Yeah,
Yep.
sure. And I was just going to say on that, one of the risks I see more and more with sort of grid connected mines as well is it's on the same sort of theme as what Chris was saying. I think that what's happening is that as more and more renewables go into the system, the ability to keep the system stable and reliable is obviously dependent on how much more ancillary services we put into it. And what that will do, I think, might drive up the fixed costs of being on the grid. And therefore, you have to balance the whole of system cost versus just the PPA price.
It's all right for you folks in WA, though. You're not on the national electricity market. So, question for you,
Our
Raj.
grid is facing the same problems.
Yeah.
Is it? Oh, dear.
Yeah.
That's no good. Do you see PPAs as being more or less commercially attractive to build, own and operate for mining companies? And what aspects would make it more cost competitive to the other?
So look, this goes to one of the points that was made earlier. My view is that if you're a miner and you have $100 million, you'd rather spend that on mining and improving the quality of your ore and shipping more ore, rather than earning an 8% return in a very commoditized asset. So my view is that the best cost of capital use of your $100 million is to use it on your own core production. And therefore, there are many sources of capital out there, very, very competitively priced to build renewable energy. Now, the only caveat to that is where operationally you want control over that facility, and there might be certain circumstances where that's necessary. But my personal view on power production is that there's plenty of people who can do it. They can do it very cost effectively. They can provide you all the guarantees that you require, and therefore to sink capital into power production for a mining company doesn't make sense to me.
Peter, do you have any comment there?
Yeah, I agree with Raj. I think the business case developments we've been doing, whilst predominantly focused on the miners' site, I mean, they've got disturbed land, they've got a load profile, you avoid the transmission distribution issues, and then obviously I spoke about the social license to operate benefits. You do get to a point, and I'm sure everyone on the call has been through this process, where when it gets to a very senior level and they're looking at the strategic decision as do we want to own and control, because obviously we want to ensure that our production is able to produce, and energy from a cost bucket perspective is far outweighed from the benefits of production. What we've been able to do with some of the contracts that we've developed is use third-party capital. The miner still controls the asset whilst they're paying off the capital charge, and then they own the asset at the end of the capital charge being paid out. So there is a nuance to that, is that you can still control the asset from day one from an operation perspective, and then you can own the asset at the end. So I think that we're getting more and more focus in that area, Raj, and I agree with you that you're better deploying capital that wants to invest in large, commoditized, potentially low-risk green infrastructure projects, especially in Australia, and you're better off using that capital than your own.
Great. And Chris, very quickly, because we haven't got too many minutes left, a question for you. You mentioned innovative PPAs to account for grid as being in variable load. Are you able to expand on that?
Sorry, I missed a bit there, Monica.
Well,
Go again, please.
you mentioned innovative power purchase agreements to account for the grid power purchase agreements being variable load. Are you able to expand on that?
Yeah, so I guess innovations in that space is what other contracts can you source that can complement your PPA. If your PPA, we consider that to be an offtake agreement of variable price and variable volume as your renewable generator generates into a variable spot market. What are the other third-party options that you can purchase to complement that? People may be aware of our Super Peak contract, which we launched into the market 4 years ago. It's a time of day contracts, which covers off on the high price or generally high price periods of the daytime in the morning and the evening. And so a purchasing of this contract can give you protection to prospectively high price periods where you may not be receiving any generation from your PPA. There's other forms of contract that you can help to complement your PPA and that are more price efficient than just going back to a retailer and looking for a fully bundled solution. That the exercise of doing that and evaluate that, we're, as I mentioned, are building a platform to allow that to be more standardized and more accessible for both the demand side with a corporate PPA buyer or the large energy PPA buyer, but also different sellers that can contribute to that. You imagine you've got a variable PPA and you've got a storage facility or a demand response capability or another wholesale market supplier that can give you a contract that can at lowest price that can help firm up your consumption and your demand against your consumption, then against your supply, then that's the contract that you should be dealing with. But at the current stage, the only real access point to do that is to go through the energy retailer. What we're seeing now is a greater distribution of options as an increasing number of energy users and energy suppliers can interact, and expansion of the wholesale energy market.
Great. Well, I think we've come to the end of our session, so I'm not getting any clues for that. I'm assuming that's 1:45. Any final comments? Raj, because you had some technical difficulties, maybe 30 seconds of any final comments you have to make.
No, I mean, from as I see it, I think there's going to be increasing renewable energy penetration. I think the last few days have shown that everyone's very keen on taking up more and more renewable energy. I think that it is a component of the decarbonization story and a very important one. And I'm really pleased to be here and to sort of